Welcome back everyone. Today we continue with the next part of this series called What If Future Gohan Was Never Killed by the Androids. Let's aim for 350 likes on this one. Also, don't forget to leave a comment letting me know if you've enjoyed the series so far. With that, let's begin. The doctors had put Gohan through the torment 4 times now, dissecting each of his limbs until they had gathered enough samples to satisfy their dark curiosity. When they finally stopped, Gohan was left trembling, his body drenched in sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His limbs, now wrapped hastily in rough bandages, were numb, but Gohan knew the damage ran deep. His left arm especially, already weak before the procedure, was in worse condition now. He forced his eyes down to the mutilated limb and frowned at the mess of flesh and bandages. Whatever they had done, Gohan knew it wasn't with the intention of saving him. Stitching and proper care weren't in the cards. This was never about healing. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. That's the point, he thought grimly, his mind clearing just enough to grasp the truth. They don't want me to survive this. As his vision swam, Gohan tried to refocus, scanning the room. The blue-skinned Ice Jin he had seen earlier was gone, leaving only the doctors and Queen Cold behind. She remained, standing there with a cold, satisfied smile on her face as she watched his every move. Her expression was one of quiet delight, as though the pain Gohan had suffered was a source of entertainment. Gohan fought to distract himself from the searing pains still throbbing through his body. He let his mind wander, forcing himself to remember better times, anything to take him away from the horror of his current situation. At first, it worked. He thought back to moments on Earth with Trunks when the boy was small, the two of them playing with toys. He remembered how Trunks used to get so upset when Gohan would hide one of his action figures. A faint smile crossed his lips as he recalled the boy's adorable scowl and fiery determination to get his toys back. But the memory quickly soured. Gohan realized the full implications of what was happening. If 2 whole days had passed, as they claimed, that meant he had been taken off Earth, out of the hemisphere, he thought with a growing sense of dread. And worse, if Queen Cold's forces had arrived only days after 17's defeat, then they could be anywhere in space by now. Panic surged through him. Wait, no. Queen Cold was planning to destroy Earth. They wouldn't leave until... His heart sank like a stone. Until Earth is gone. 2 days was a long time for a one-sided battle. Gohan knew that Trunks, despite all his strength, wasn't powerful enough to hold off an invasion like this. And 18. Gohan clenched his teeth. 18 never cared enough to intervene unless Gohan pushed her. Without him there to guide her, she wouldn't lift a finger to protect Earth's people. The realization left him feeling hollow. He might have already lost his home, and with it, any chance of returning to the life he once knew. A tired, bitter laugh escaped his lips as he turned his head slowly, painfully, to face Queen Cold. Through ragged breaths, he managed to gasp out, "Why, don't you just kill me now? What's the point of dragging this out? You've already won." Queen Cold's laughter filled the room, sharp and cruel. She stepped closer, her eyes glinting with twisted amusement as she looked down at Gohan's broken form. "No, sane mutt," she replied smoothly, her voice dripping with malice. "I haven't truly won until I've hurt you in every way possible. And that doesn't just mean physically." Gohan shuddered at the words, the cold promise in her voice sending a chill through him. He had endured so much already, but her words made it clear that the worst was yet to come. Whatever torture lay ahead wouldn't just be physical. As if on cue, the 3 alien doctors began to gather again around the table, their strange alien tools gleaming menacingly in the bright lights of the room. They were ready to begin again, their faces devoid of any emotion as they prepared for the next round of torment. But before they could move forward, the door to the room burst open with a loud clang. A blue-skinned Ice Jin, similar to the one Gohan had seen earlier, sprinted into the room, panting heavily. His arrival startled everyone, including Queen Cold. All eyes turned to him as he quickly bowed, speaking in gasps. "My queen," he said urgently, "we must act now. I fear the cyborg and the android may arrive at the ship any minute." The smile that had lingered on Queen Cold's face vanished instantly. Her eyes narrowed. "Cyborg?" she asked coldly. "I thought that one had already been taken care of." The blue-skinned Ice Jin shook his head quickly. "It seems not, my queen. The cyborg and the android have already torn through our second ship, and none of our forces were able to slow them down. They're heading for us now, and we have no real defenses left, aside from me." Queen Cold stood silently for a moment, processing the news, her sharp eyes calculating. She nodded curtly. "I understand. Have the power balls been prepared?" "Yes, my queen," the Ice Jin named Gelid replied, his voice calming as he straightened up. "There should be enough Blutz waves to trigger the transformation, no matter where the drop point is. Power balls, Blutz waves. Gohan's mind struggled to latch onto the familiar terms. Where have I heard that before? He tried to focus, straining to remember. Queen Cold's cruel smile returned as she praised her subordinate. Excellent work, Gelid. Now, go stall those creatures for as long as you can. And remember, you are forbidden from dying. If you've done all you can, then retreat. Gelid smiled back, nodding quickly. Thank you, my queen. Without another word, he turned and bolted from the room. Queen Cold let out a disappointed sigh before looking at the trio of doctors who still hovered around Gohan. They seemed hesitant, unsure of what to do next. The queen's eyes flashed dangerously as she gave her command. We've run out of time, she said with authority. We must begin the final stage now. One of the doctors, his face pale, spoke up in protest. But your majesty, there's still so much more to be done. The queen's gaze darkened as she silenced him with a low growl. I care not. We have what we need. If we delay further, our lives will be forfeit. The doctors exchanged nervous glances but ultimately nodded, knowing better than to defy their queen. They turned back to Gohan, who was lying half-conscious on the table, his vision blurry as he tried to make sense of the conversation. Without a word, they unstrapped his limbs and rolled him onto his stomach, generating a sharp, agonized scream from Gohan as his damaged muscles convulsed in response to the movement. The pain ripped through his body like fire, and he gasped for air, the agony too much to bear. Ignoring his cries, the doctors reclamped his wrists and ankles to the table, securing him tightly to the cold, steel surface once more. Gohan lay on the cold steel table, his body weak and battered, unable to muster the strength to lift his head anymore. The pain from the recent procedures had drained him almost completely, and his mind wandered aimlessly in the haze of exhaustion. He could hear the doctors bustling around him, but the sounds felt distant, as though he were slipping away from the world around him. Somewhere deep within, he felt a small spark of hope at the mention of the cyborg and android fighting back. It meant Earth wasn't completely defenseless. Maybe, just maybe, the planet was still holding on. But that fleeting hope dissolved as quickly as it had come. What does it matter now? Gohan thought bitterly. Even if Earth survived, he was far from it, trapped in this nightmarish place, and he'd never see his home again. Still, he couldn't shake the curiosity that gnawed at him. What did the Ice Djinn's strange conversation about power balls and Blutz waves have to do with anything? Why did those words stir something in his memory? Before he could think any further, a searing pain jolted him out of his thoughts. It shot through his body like a lightning bolt, radiating from the base of his spine. Gohan gasped, his chest heaving as his consciousness teetered on the brink of collapse. The agony was intense, like nothing he'd ever felt before, but also strangely familiar. His vision swam, darkening at the edges, and he fought to stay awake. I've felt this before. Suddenly, it clicked. Gohan's eyes flew open in shock. It feels like my tail is being grabbed. His mind raced, struggling to make sense of it. But that's impossible. My tail was removed years ago, wasn't it? The last time was during the fight with Turles. How could I be feeling this now? Desperate for answers, Gohan tried to recall his time in the healing tank. Could his tail have somehow regrown without him noticing? No, that didn't make sense. He would have felt it, and the stretcher he had been carried on would have crushed it beneath his weight. He shuddered at the thought of the pain that would have caused. Gritting his teeth through the waves of discomfort, Gohan forced out a shaky question between labored breaths. What are you doing to me? A cold, mocking voice answered him. Just a minor adjustment, little San. Queen Cold replied smoothly. Her tone dripped with sadistic pleasure. You'll be released soon. Released? Gohan's mind spun in confusion. Why would they release me? After everything they've done, what's the point of setting me free? Just then, he caught sight of one of the doctors approaching his side. The alien held a syringe filled with an ominous-looking lime-green liquid. The creature's eyes flickered with uncertainty as he glanced at his colleagues. When do I inject him? Now. No, the other doctors shouted in unison. One rushed over, snatching the syringe out of the first doctor's hand before slapping him hard across the back of the head. Idiot, the aggressor snapped. Do you realize how close you just came to ruining everything? We don't inject until the tail's fully out and we get the signal. Do you want to get us all killed? He then turned to Queen Cold, who remained out of Gohan's direct line of sight, and bowed deeply. My apologies, my queen. His incompetence stems from his lack of experience. Queen Cold's voice was tight with irritation. I understand, she said flatly, her patience clearly wearing thin. From somewhere near Gohan's legs, another voice rang out. It's almost out. The words echoed through Gohan's foggy mind, repeating over and over until he pieced together their meaning. Wait, they're trying to pull out my tail. The realization struck Gohan with a new kind of horror. His heart raced as panic took over, overriding the pain for a moment. He twisted his head to catch a glimpse of Queen Cold, his voice rising in desperation. "You can't just rip out my tail. It doesn't work like that. Oh, how little you know about your own kind, you sane mutt," Queen Cold taunted, her voice filled with condescension. "We've seen it done before. Believe it or not, you're not the only sane left in the universe." Gohan's eyes widened in shock. What? His mind scrambled to process her words. Another Saiyan? There's another one out there? His voice trembled with surprise. You have another Saiyan on this ship?" Queen Cold let out an exasperated sigh, clearly growing tired of his questions. "Not anymore," she said dismissively. "But we did. The fool managed to pull out his tail and transform into an Uzuru. He used the transformation to escape." Gohan's mind raced with 100 questions. Another Saiyan. Who could it have been? Could there be more of us out there? The thoughts flooded his mind, momentarily pushing the pain aside. For so long, he and Trunks had believed they were the last of their kind. Could it really be true that there were others scattered across the universe, just like him? His racing thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a strange sensation at the base of his spine. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, but was still so deeply familiar. His tail, he could feel it again. The appendage had reappeared, growing from his lower back. It whipped around wildly, as if sensing the danger, lashing out at the doctors and smacking against his thighs and upper back. One of the doctors let out a yelp as the tail hit him squarely in the face before it was quickly subdued by a strong, restraining grip. "It's out!" one of the doctors announced triumphantly, his voice strained from holding Gohan's tail in place. Queen Cold's cold smile widened as she observed the procedure with an air of satisfaction. "Good work, boys," she said, her voice dripping with approval. She pressed a small device on her blouse, resembling a microphone, and within moments, the same two aliens who had carried Gohan into the room earlier appeared again. They arrived with the same crude stretcher, and the doctors hurried to undo the restraints binding Gohan's mutilated limbs to the table. With little care, they lifted his battered body and placed him back onto the stretcher. Gohan could only manage a faint, pitiful groan as they moved him. The blood loss had drained him of almost all sensation, and even though his body screamed with pain, he couldn't do much more than murmur under his breath. In the back of his mind, Gohan felt a grim relief that they hadn't flipped him onto his back during the transfer. His tail, newly returned and still throbbing with a strange mix of discomfort and confusion, remained free from pressure. If they had forced him to lie on it, Gohan knew it would have sent waves of agony up his spine. "At least I caught one break in this nightmare," he thought darkly. As they exited the operating room, Gohan, barely conscious, caught snippets of conversation between the doctors. "And don't forget the CSBF. We'll need it to complete this," one of the doctors called out. CSBF? What now? Gohan's muddled mind couldn't keep up with all the strange terms being thrown around. He was too weak to process them fully, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of his head that something terrible was about to happen. The two aliens who had carried him said nothing this time as they transported him down the hall. Queen Cold and the three doctors followed close behind, their presence a chilling reminder of the power they held over him. It wasn't long before they entered another room. Gohan was set down into an uncomfortable chair in the center of the room, the seat hard and unforgiving beneath him. His foggy vision just barely registered the two stretcher carriers waving a quick goodbye before they slipped out of the room, leaving him alone with his tormentors. Gohan tried to lift his head but could barely muster the strength. His body was unrestrained, though it didn't feel like it mattered. He was so weak that even sitting up felt like an impossible task. The room was vast, empty and eerily spacious, large enough that an army could probably march through it. Across from him, Queen Cold and the doctors had gathered near a control panel on the far right wall. The controls looked simple enough, with only a single lever jutting out from the panel, but their focus on it made Gohan uneasy. One of the doctors, the one with the strange horns protruding from his head, slowly made his way over to Gohan, syringe in hand. The lime green liquid inside glowed faintly as the doctor approached, and Gohan's gaze locked onto it. The fluid looked ominous, its color unnatural, and a deep sense of dread settled in his gut. The doctor drew closer, preparing to inject the needle into a prominent vein on Gohan's forearm. Gohan's chest tightened with panic, but he barely had the energy to speak. What is that?" he asked weakly, his voice barely a whisper. Queen Cold stepped forward with an amused grin. She had heard him despite his frail state. "This," she began, her tone mocking, "is what my scientists call the concentrated senzu bean formula, or CSBF for short, concentrated senzu bean." Gohan's muddled thoughts tried to grasp the significance, but only one response managed to escape his lips. "That's a dumb name. he muttered. For a moment, there was silence. It seemed his comment had taken Queen Cold by surprise. Then, after a brief pause, she chuckled. You're more interested in the name rather than the effects? How peculiar. No matter. You'll understand soon enough. The doctor holding the syringe hesitated, glancing nervously toward Queen Cold. Now? He asked, his hand trembling slightly. Queen Cold gave a simple nod, her smirk widening. Now. Gohan barely felt the needle as it pierced his skin. He was so numb from everything that had happened, so lost in the haze of his own thoughts, that this new pain seemed insignificant compared to what he had already endured. But then the words Queen Cold had spoken began to sink in. Wait, Senzu Bean. Realization struck him like a blast of energy. They're injecting me with a liquefied Senzu Bean. His eyes widened in panic. Wait, he screamed, suddenly filled with dread as his mind connected the dots. But it was too late. The syringe was already empty, the lime-green liquid coursing through his veins. A light chuckle escaped Queen Cold's lips as she watched him writhe in fear. She and the doctors rushed back to the control panel, where the horned doctor gripped the lever tightly. You seem to understand now what's happening, Queen Cold said, her voice dripping with triumph. Did you really think we would just waste such a valuable resource? Harnessing the power of this bean will lead us to countless victories. Gohan's body began to tremble uncontrollably as he felt the energy surging back into him. The Senzu Bean's effects were taking hold, restoring his strength at an alarming rate. His muscles tightened and his skin began to regenerate, but the process was far from smooth. The rapid healing felt unnatural, violent, even, as if his body was being forced back together in ways it wasn't ready for. I'll kill you, Gohan roared, his voice growing stronger with each passing second. You and this entire ship are going to die. Queen Cold didn't flinch at his threat. Her voice remained calm, even amused. No, you won't, she said smoothly. By the time this is over, you won't even know who your enemies are. Gohan didn't have time to comprehend her words. His arm was healing before his very eyes, muscles and sinews knitting themselves back together with terrifying speed. The pain was unbearable, far worse than anything he'd experienced during the operation. It felt like his entire body was being torn apart and put back together again, stretching his skin and tissue in ways that defied nature. He screamed as his legs began to mend, the bones realigning and the muscles repairing themselves with the same unnatural force. Gohan could feel the Senzu serum rushing through his veins, restoring him completely. His energy surged back to its maximum level, and every trace of the poison that had lingered in his system was now gone. But something was wrong. This didn't feel like a normal recovery. It didn't stop there. His body trembled as an overwhelming amount of energy poured into him, filling his Kai reserves to the point of near pain. It felt unnatural, like his body was being stuffed beyond its limit. Instinctively, Gohan transformed into his Super Saiyan form, hoping to burn off some of the excess energy, but it barely made a difference. The power just kept coming. Gritting his teeth, Gohan turned sharply toward the group by the lever, his eyes narrowing as he felt the energy threatening to tear him apart. His hands twitched, and he began to gather the swirling energy into a Masenko blast. He needed to release this power before it consumed him. But then, just as he was about to fire, the floor beneath him gave way, crumbling into a sudden void. Gohan dropped in surprise, barely managing to catch a glimpse of the scientist by the lever. The lever had been pulled, triggering the trap beneath him. Though the chair he had been restrained in plummeted, Gohan floated in midair just beneath the closing steel doors. His golden aura flickered as he hovered there, his eyes locking on to the cold, emotionless gaze of the Ice Djinn standing above. For a brief moment, the two stared at each other. Then, the doors sealed shut with a harsh clang, cutting off his view of them entirely. Gohan's entire body continued to shake as his Super Saiyan form struggled to hold back the ever-increasing surge of power. It was overwhelming. He felt like he was about to explode, like a dam ready to burst under too much pressure. His muscles tightened, veins bulging beneath his skin as he clenched his fists, trying to keep himself together. But it was no use. The energy kept coming, and then it hit him. He knew what was happening. As the name CSBF echoed through his mind, Gohan realized what this was all about. It all made sense now. He had replayed that name over and over in his head, and now he understood the terrible truth. Back when he was younger, far more curious than cautious, Gohan had always wondered why the Senzu Bean could fully rejuvenate a fighter, no matter how strong. It was an odd thing, something that had always nagged at the back of his mind. Eventually, he went to Bulma for answers, and she had taken up the mystery with her usual scientific curiosity. After extensive testing, Bulma had concluded that there was indeed a limit to what the Senzu could restore, but that limit was so high, it was beyond anything Gohan could reach at the time, so there was no need to worry about it. At least, that's what she had told him. But Gohan wasn't worried about the Senzu losing its effectiveness. No, he was more interested in how it worked. Why did the Senzu bean stop granting power once the fighter was fully healed? He pressed Bulma for an answer, and she had given him a theory. It likely had something to do with the digestive system. Once the body reached its peak, the remaining energy from the Senzu would be neutralized by stomach acids and then digested like any other food. At the time, Gohan had laughed hard. The idea of overpowered poop was just too funny for a 12-year-old to handle. But later, when the joke wore off, his curiosity returned. He came back to Bulma with a more serious question. What would happen if the Senzu's energy was injected directly into the bloodstream? What if the stomach couldn't neutralize it? How strong would someone become? Bulma had been intrigued, just as Gohan was. They both wondered, what if the Senzu serum could generate enough power to surpass the androids? It was a dangerous thought, but exciting nonetheless. Bulma had worked for a week straight, experimenting with the bean until she finally managed to liquefy it into a potent serum. Gohan had been eager to try it out, imagining the rush of power he would feel. But Bulma, ever the cautious one, insisted on testing it on animals first. Gohan had rolled his eyes but let her run the trials. The results had been shocking. Every time Bulma injected the serum into a small animal, the creature would go berserk. The rats couldn't handle the sheer energy coursing through them. Without the ability to control Kai, their bodies couldn't release the power, and they ended up exploding in flashes of light and blood. Bulma had immediately shut down the experiment, warning Gohan that it was too dangerous. "This is nothing to mess with, Gohan," she had said. "Even with your control, this could destroy you." But Gohan didn't listen. He was different. He was a sane warrior, with far greater control over his Kai than any animal could ever have. He was sure he could handle it. He had convinced himself that his training and experience would allow him to safely absorb the serum. That is, until he tried it. The son of Goku, Gohan, had managed to finally convince Bulma to run the test on him, though she only agreed to use the bare minimum of the serum. She had been hesitant, but Gohan, brimming with confidence and curiosity, had pushed her enough to let him go through with it. Before the experiment, the young preteen had undergone a rigorous workout, pushing himself to his limits. He figured the test would be the perfect way to rejuvenate his body afterward. He now realized how naive that thinking had been. They walked down to Bulma's lab, located in the basement. Gohan remembered the familiar sights of the lab, clean and sterile, filled with cutting-edge technology. Bulma had led him to a large glass containment room, one that was the size of a small bedroom. Inside, she had set up cameras at each corner, ready to monitor and record the effects of the serum on Gohan's body. The room itself was mostly empty, save for a simple table and chair, where a small vial of the serum sat waiting. The liquid inside was a bright lime green, only a sliver of it resting in the syringe. Gohan had sat down eagerly, filled with anticipation. This would be his moment, to feel a power unlike anything before. Grabbing the needle with steady hands, he injected the serum into his arm, letting the cool liquid flow into his veins. At first, everything seemed fine. He let out a deep sigh of relief as he felt the effects almost immediately. The exhaustion from his workout vanished, replaced by a refreshing surge of energy. It felt good, natural even. But then, something strange happened. The energy didn't stop building. Instead of leveling off like he expected, the power continued to rise within him, becoming more intense with each passing second. Frowning in confusion, Gohan shifted in his seat. He had taken Senzu beans before, and they always stopped once his body was at peak condition. But this time, the sensation kept going, and it was unsettling. After another minute of the energy increasing steadily, Gohan realized he was well beyond his normal limits. Panic began to flicker in the back of his mind. He transformed into his Super Saiyan form, hoping the transformation would burn off some of the energy flooding into him. His golden aura erupted around him as his power level spiked, but even that wasn't enough. The energy just kept pouring in, waves of it crashing through his body like an unstoppable force. His heart began to race. Something was very wrong. Sweat dripped down his face as the strength building inside him became too much to contain. His ki flared uncontrollably, and he could feel small beams of light beginning to shoot from his fingertips, singeing the floor beneath him. The young boy's mind raced as he tried desperately to force the energy back down, but it was no use. The pressure continued to mount. Gohan gasped in pain as the energy tore through him. It felt like his insides were on fire, his entire body glowing bright with power he couldn't control. He fell to his hands and knees, staring wide-eyed at the floor, trying to process what was happening. The overwhelming ki was too much for him to handle. From outside the glass, Bulma had been watching the entire time, monitoring the experiment with a sharp eye. At first, everything had seemed to be going as planned, but now, she noticed the distress on Gohan's face. The unusual spikes in his energy levels alerted her that something was horribly wrong. With alarm in her eyes, Bulma rushed into the glass chamber, ignoring the monitors and the cameras. Gohan, struggling to contain the violent power, pleaded with her to stay back. "No, Bulma, don't come near," he managed to groan through gritted teeth. But Bulma, always caring and protective, ignored his warnings. She knelt beside him, reaching out a hand to place on his shoulder, trying to calm him down. "Gohan, we'll figure this out, just hang on," she started to say, her voice gentle but laced with concern. Gohan's vision was clouded with energy, his mind buzzing with the overflow of power. He knew Bulma couldn't stay close. If she did, he would end up hurting her. He tried to push her hand away as gently as he could, knowing his own strength, but his movements were no longer under his full control. His energy-filled hand moved in a flash, faster than he had ever moved before. His hand struck Bulma's wrist, hard and violent, creating a sickening crack that echoed in the small room. Bulma screamed in pain as the force of the blow snapped several bones in her wrist. She stumbled back, clutching her arm in shock, tears forming in her eyes as she tried to process what had just happened. For a moment, she could only stare at Gohan, wide-eyed with terror, unable to comprehend the sudden turn of events. Gohan's heart sank as he saw the pain and fear in her eyes. He tried to apologize, to explain, but his words were jumbled and messy, caught between the overwhelming energy inside him and his guilt over what he had done. His body continued to shake uncontrollably, trembling with the power he was desperately trying to suppress. His broken words only terrified Bulma further. She must have thought he had lost his mind completely. In that moment, Gohan feared she might be right. His thoughts turned dark as he weighed his options. He knew that if he didn't release some of this energy soon, it would tear him apart from the inside. The thought terrified him. But what terrified him even more was the brief fleeting moment when he considered letting the power loose right then and there. It would end everything. Bulma would be caught in the explosion, but maybe, just maybe, she would understand. He shuddered at the thought, horrified that it had even crossed his mind. Gritting his teeth, Gohan fought back the dark impulses and forced himself to speak through the pain. "Be Bulma, get out of the house," he stammered, his voice barely coherent. I can't hold this back much longer." Bulma, clutching her broken wrist, looked at him with wide, fearful eyes but nodded quickly. She turned and ran from the room, bolting up the stairs as fast as she could. Gohan tracked her energy, feeling her rush to the living room, where her son was playing. She grabbed him, and together they raced outside. But as Gohan felt their presence, he realized with a sinking heart, they were still too close. Gohan felt his heart race as the energy inside him continued to build to an unbearable level. He knew there were only two possible outcomes now. Either he was going to release this terrifying power or he was going to die trying to contain it. His small body trembled under the immense pressure, more power than he had ever felt before surging through his veins. He gritted his teeth and closed his eyes for a moment, praying that Bulma and her son were far enough away. They had to be. He wouldn't survive long enough for a second attempt. The explosion was going to be massive, and Gohan knew that better than anyone. The young sane boy glanced up at the ceiling of the basement with a mix of determination and dread. There was no more time to waste. If he didn't release the energy now, he wouldn't live long enough to see another moment. His shaky hands moved to his forehead, gathering all the power he could control into his palms, feeling the weight of it threatening to tear him apart. With a desperate roar, he threw his hands up toward the ceiling, shouting with all his might, "Masenko!" A brilliant golden beam exploded from his hands, shooting upward with the force of an earthquake. The sheer intensity of the blast shook the ground beneath him, the floor trembling as if the earth itself was groaning under the weight of the attack. The beam was so large, so overwhelming, that if Gohan looked up, all he could see was the blinding yellow energy that filled the room. It consumed everything in sight. The roaring sound of the Masenko drowned out everything else, the crackling of energy, the trembling of the ground, even the distant cries of terror from nearby houses as the earthquake rocked the area. Gohan's scream joined the cacophony as the unimaginable power coursed through his small arms. It felt like fire, searing through his muscles, burning them from the inside out. Every second the blast continued was pure agony, the kind of pain he had never experienced before. It felt like years had passed before the energy finally began to fade, the intensity slowly decreasing until there was nothing left. When the last of the Senzu-infused energy was finally expelled, Gohan collapsed onto the ground, his body completely spent. Darkness overtook him as he lost consciousness, the pain and exhaustion dragging him into a deep, dreamless sleep. It took several days for Gohan to recover. When he finally awoke, weak and disoriented, he found himself lying in a bed surrounded by the familiar setting of Bulma's lab. His body ached, still feeling the after effects of the tremendous strain. But as he lay there, memories of what had happened slowly began to return. The experiment, the uncontrollable power, the Masenko. Once he was strong enough to sit up, Gohan learned that the experiment had not only destroyed Bulma's entire mansion but had also caused significant damage to the surrounding area. No one had died, thankfully, but several citizens had been injured as a result of the earthquake caused by his attack. There were even lawsuits being filed against Bulma, as the damage to the neighborhood was severe. Bulma, always the protective mother figure, refused to place any blame on Gohan, though he knew deep down that it was his fault. She kept calling it the experiment, making it clear that she didn't want Gohan to feel responsible. Still, guilt weighed heavily on the young preteen. His reckless curiosity had led to this disaster. The thought of what could have happened if Bulma hadn't escaped in time sent a chill through him. They had both sworn never to attempt anything like that again. Deciding the current state of the Senzu was more than satisfactory. Any further testing could very well lead to death, and Gohan didn't want to put anyone else at risk. Despite everything, Gohan's mind couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if a full Senzu bean were injected into someone? How much power would that person gain? Would anyone be strong enough to survive it? He shuddered at the thought, knowing that he had nearly lost himself to the power. But for some reason, deep down, he couldn't shake the lingering curiosity. Now, floating in the outer hemisphere of the Earth, Gohan took a deep breath. His surroundings were calm, and the planet below looked peaceful, a beautiful sight that brought a wave of relief over him. Earth was still intact. He had somehow managed to avoid complete destruction. He began to descend slowly, heading back toward the home he had once fought so hard to protect. As he floated downward, the calmness of the moment was broken by something unexpected. In the distance, the sounds of a fierce battle echoed through the sky. Gohan immediately snapped to attention, whipping his head toward the source of the noise. His sharp eyes quickly caught sight of two figures fighting ferociously in the distance, their energy signatures blazing brightly even from where he stood. One of the fighters was unmistakably an Ice Jin. The creature's armor was massive, larger than any he had seen before. It reminded him of the time he had faced off against Cooler, whose fifth form had dwarfed Goku in size. The sight of this towering Ice Jin sent shivers down Gohan's spine. Whoever this was, their power was immense, far beyond what he had ever expected. The armor only made the creature more intimidating, every movement of its colossal form filled with raw power. Gohan shifted his gaze to the smaller fighter, who was zipping around the Ice Jin with incredible speed. Despite their best efforts, it was clear they were struggling. Every time they attempted an attack, the Ice Jin would counter with a devastating blow, sending the smaller figure reeling. Yet strangely, the smaller fighter never seemed to slow down, never showed signs of fatigue, continuing their assault with relentless energy. It wasn't until Gohan focused on the smaller figure that he noticed something odd. The fighter was only using one arm. He squinted, straining to get a clearer look. Then, he saw the distinct, familiar blonde hair. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized her. 18, Gohan called out, his voice filled with surprise and concern. At the sound of her name, 18 snapped her head toward Gohan, only to be distracted for a split second, just enough time for the Ice Jin to take advantage. His massive fist crashed into her jaw with a bone-rattling uppercut. 18 was sent flipping backward through the air, gritting her teeth in frustration before she managed to steady herself a few seconds later. She growled, her eyes locked onto the towering creature in front of her. Without glancing back at Gohan, she shouted angrily, "Get over here and help me, now! I'm getting tired of this freak." Gohan, watching the scene unfold from a safe distance, couldn't help but chuckle. "Enjoy your struggle, 18. Now you know how it feels," he called out, his voice filled with amusement. 18's enraged scream could barely be heard as the Ice Jin landed another crushing blow. This time, he drove his massive fist deep into her stomach, forcing her to double over in pain. Then, with a brutal double axe handle, he brought his fists down on her back, sending her plummeting face first toward the earth. 18 grunted as she crashed through the air, but, ever resilient, she managed to right herself before hitting the ground. Filled with rage, she charged right back toward the hulking figure. Gohan couldn't help but smile at her frustration. For a moment, her battle had been a nice distraction from his own overwhelming predicament. But reality soon came crashing back. His body was still overflowing with the intense, uncontrollable energy from the Senzu serum, and it wouldn't be long before it consumed him entirely. "I've got to release this power somehow," Gohan thought to himself, clenching his fists as he hovered in the air. And what better way to do it than on an enemy? It's like hitting two birds with one stone. Though, why would anyone want to hurt birds? What did they ever do to anyone? His mind briefly wandered before he refocused on the task at hand. With that thought, Gohan began gathering a massive sphere of golden energy in his right hand, feeling the rogue power swirl violently inside him. He glanced down at his left arm, which was still weak from the damage it had taken earlier, but he decided to charge up a smaller ball of energy there as well. The orb glowed faintly, reflecting his limited strength, but it would have to do for now. Letting out a powerful roar, Gohan threw both hands forward, aiming directly at the cargo bay of the ship he had just been released from. A brilliant beam of golden energy erupted from his hands, surging toward the ship with immense force. The attack tore through the ship's hull almost instantly, punching through the bottom and bursting out of the top in mere seconds. To Gohan's surprise, the ship began to tear apart more easily than he had anticipated. Rather than stop the beam and target another spot, he decided to continue pouring energy into the attack, using the glowing stream of Kai like a blade. He dragged the beam downward, slicing through the ship's metal structure, nearly cutting it in half. But before he could finish, something unexpected happened. An arm wrapped tightly around his waist, yanking him out of position and sending him tumbling through the air. Gohan gasped in surprise as he fell toward the Earth's atmosphere, quickly righting himself and spinning around to confront his attacker. To his shock, it wasn't the Ice Djinn who had grabbed him, but 18. She floated before him, her expression a mix of irritation and amusement. With her one remaining arm, she reached into her pocket, clearly agitated by Gohan's antics. "What the hell are you doing, 18? Gohan yelled, his voice dripping with frustration. "Can't you see I'm trying to take out the rest of Queen Cold's forces?" 18 snarled in response, her eyes narrowed. "I told you to come help me, you idiot. Now that big ugly freak is heading right for us, and you're going to help me beat him." She glanced at him and raised an eyebrow before adding with a smirk, "Also, why are you naked?" Gohan blinked in confusion. "Wait, what? He looked down at himself and immediately blushed furiously. He had completely forgotten that he was still nude from his time in the healing tank. His hands flew to cover himself as he stammered, "They took my clothes, okay? Stop looking at me." 18 couldn't hold back a snort of laughter. "Don't worry, I'm not interested," she said with a teasing grin. "But seriously, stripped naked by aliens? And how was the probing, by the way?" She burst into giggles at her own joke, clearly enjoying Gohan's embarrassment. "Ugh, shut up, 18, Gohan muttered, covering his face with one hand as he cringed. But 18's laughter only grew louder. "You really shouldn't say that when you're naked, you know. Ha 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 ha." Before Gohan could respond, he felt a sharp, sudden pain as a violent knee slammed into his back, sending him hurtling toward 18. She easily dodged out of the way, leaving Gohan to crash through the air. But even after the powerful blow, he quickly recovered, floating back upright with barely a scratch. Surprised by how little damage he had taken, Gohan realized that the Senzu serum still running through his veins was healing him faster than usual. Even the Ice Djinn's enhanced strength and advanced form couldn't hurt him as much as they should have. For a brief moment, Gohan felt grateful for the serum, until he remembered the consequences if he didn't release the energy coursing through him. He could feel it bubbling beneath the surface, threatening to burst free at any moment. He needed to act fast. Determined, Gohan shot forward toward 18 and the Ice Djinn, who were once again locked in combat. 18 had been skillfully dodging the creature's blows, but as Gohan approached, she was caught off guard by a vicious roundhouse kick to the chest. The force of the blow sent her flying backward, her curses echoing through the air as she tumbled away. Gohan couldn't help but laugh at her misfortune, even as he zipped around the metallic Ice Djinn. With a well-placed elbow, he struck the side of the creature's neck, feeling the impact reverberate through his arm. That's it for this episode, guys. If you've watched to the end, then that may be an indication that you enjoy the episode, so please drop a like so the video could reach more people. See you in the next episode, take care.